I see the number of participants is starting to jump up pretty quickly. We've got just a few minutes and we'll be getting started right on time at 4 o'clock. Okay, it's 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to Food as Medicine. I'm Dr. Lacey Valdivias, the host of this series, and I'm the Director of Community Programs and Education with the Food Bank of Santa Barbara County. Food as Medicine is an educational series that we sponsor at the Food Bank. It aims to bring cutting-edge nutrition science to our local community in order to increase health and well-being for all of us. Tonight, we have an awesome presentation for you. We're going to be comparing some popular diet trends that you may be curious about, with hopes you'll be able to identify one that is a good fit for you and your individual needs. We have over 100 people registered to attend this evening. You won't be able to hear or see each other, but we do encourage you to type any questions that you have into the chat box. That way I can read them aloud to our presenters at the end and give them a chance to address your questions. So tonight we have two authors who have been instrumental in creating the Food as Medicine program. They've produced numerous presentations for us, including The Power of Cruciferous Vegetables and Digestion Connection. Randi Miller is a functional diagnostics nutrition practitioner and an IIN health coach. And Vibeke Weiland is a nutrition consultant. Tonight, they'll be sharing with us diet decisions. What should I eat to be healthy? Vibeke and Randi, thank you so much for doing this tonight, and I'll hand it over to you whenever you're ready.
Okay, so thank you, Lacey, for that introduction. We want to start with a disclaimer really quick before we dive in, and that is that we are not doctors. We don't play doctors on TV, and this whole talk is meant purely as education and information, not as medical advice. The idea is that you could take this information and discuss it with your healthcare practitioner. And our focus here is going to be on food and diets, but we want to be sure to note that there are other equally important foundations for good health. Things like movement and, exercise, stress management, sleep, having a sense of community and purpose. These things are all foundational to good health and must not be overlooked. And we want you to know that your diet is not the be all and end all of your health. And just as one example, if you're in a toxic relationship or a toxic job, there's no amount of healthy vegetables you can eat that's going to fix your health in that kind of a situation. So want to get that, cleared off the table right from the beginning.
Okay, so let's begin with the presentation. We chose our topic today because people are always asking us, what should I eat to be healthy? What should I eat to be healthy? And there are so many diets out there, and research can be very contradictory. One day you hear something's good for you, the next day you hear it's not. So how is anyone supposed to figure out what to eat? So today what we're going to do is we're going to give you a high-level description of the more popular diets. Some of them are carnivore, keto, paleo, and some of the paleo relatives, Mediterranean, vegetarian, vegan, and we're going to give you the pros and cons of each. There will be even more detailed info for you in your packet on the pros and the cons. We've just selected the most significant ones. By the way, after this presentation, you should receive an email from the food bank with a packet attachment. So the packet is going to be a summary of everything we're covering today. So be sure to check your email after the presentation. Note today that when we say diet, we mean way of eating. So we're not referring to weight loss. We call this presentation What to Eat to Be Healthy, not What to Eat to Lose Weight. So any one of the diets we're going to talk about today can be used for weight loss if it's being done with weight loss in mind, specifically by increasing fresh vegetables and by managing portion sizes. Some of the diets are easier for weight loss than others, and we'll touch on that a little bit today. So to start, we organize these diets on a carb consumption continuum, low to high carb. We could have easily chosen another metric like fat or protein, but we chose carbs for two reasons. First, because carbs are a pretty popular topic. And secondly, they can significantly affect your blood sugar, which is a really big deal. In fact, as we go through the diets today, you're going to hear us talk about a diet's effect on blood sugar as a pro or a con. So we want to explain blood sugar here because it's that important. Why is it important? Well, research is showing that constant blood sugar swings over years and over decades really are such a massive stressor on our body that it can actually lead to more than just what you hear about like insulin resistance and diabetes. It can also lead to hormone imbalances, heart disease, strokes, cancer, Alzheimer's, and all kinds of chronic conditions. So first, how do you even know if your blood sugar is out of balance? Symptoms. So what are the symptoms? If you're shaky, if you're irritable, if you're hangry or headachy, or have a hard time concentrating when you're hungry, likely your blood sugar is imbalanced. And I know this used to be me. People used to try to talk to me if I was hungry and there would be no point because I couldn't hear them until I ate something. That is a big red flag that your blood sugar is not balanced. If you find you're waking up at night, it could be blood sugar imbalance. When your blood sugar is balanced, your energy and your mood should be the same before and after meals. So you shouldn't be more tired after food or more energized after food. Your energy level should stay even, independent of food. Also, if you can't go for more than 2 or 3 hours without eating and feeling lousy, likely your blood sugar is not stable. What does it feel like when your blood sugar is stable? Well, you can usually go 4 or 5 hours between meals with no symptoms. At mealtime, you feel hungry. After the meal, you don't feel hungry anymore, but you shouldn't feel bad in any way or desperate to eat in order to function. So now that you know what blood sugar imbalances feel like, let's just take a quick look at what's happening inside your body that's causing those symptoms. So our bodies work best when our blood sugar levels stay within a pretty specific range, generally thought to be anywhere between 70 and 140 milligrams per deciliter of blood. So 70 to, let's say 90 would be in a fasted state, and ideally up to 120 or even 140 1 hour after a meal. Let's take a look at the graph to better understand it. So first, take a look at that blue line that's inside the green dotted lines. This is where we want to be. This is the sweet spot. How do we stay there? Well, when we eat a meal that contains a mix of protein, fat, and fiber, our blood sugar curve tends to stay flatter and balanced. Why? Because protein, fat, and fiber, or as we like to call it, PFF, and you're going to hear us talk about PFF a lot today. Protein, fat, fiber, PFF. Protein, fat, and fiber slows down the breakdown of sugar in your bloodstream. So think of protein, fat, and fiber as those big semis on the highway that are always blocking, and you know, those little cars that are trying to speed past, but they can't get past those big trucks. So those little cars are like sugar, and the protein, fat, and fiber are those big trucks slowing down the sugar breakdown. So PFF slows down that sugary traffic, and that gives us a slow drip of sugar over time rather than a massive spike all at once. So now take a look at that red line on the left. That large spike is a blood sugar swing. It means a massive amount of sugar came into the blood at once, maybe from eating processed foods, because processed foods made from sugar and refined flours get broken down and absorbed into our bloodstream really quickly. So in response to this massive amount of sugar, our bodies produce an equally massive amount of insulin to rush that sugar out of the blood and into our cells. So all that insulin, when it does its job right, causes the blood sugar then to drop like a rock, because now it's out of your blood and it's into your cells. So then we feel shaky and irritable and tired. So what do we do when we feel shaky and irritable and tired because our blood sugar is low? We eat more sugary foods to feel better, and the cycle begins again. So this is the blood sugar roller coaster. You don't want to be on that ride. Looking at the orange line, we see a similar but smaller blood sugar spike. So what can cause that? Well, we're learning that even some unrefined complex carbs like healthy whole grains, and even naturally sugary foods like dried or high glycemic fruit can have a blood sugar spiking effect on certain individuals, particularly when they're eaten alone and not in combination with protein or fat. The effect might not be as pronounced as with the refined sugars, but over time it can be problematic in the same way, with those spikes going up, down, up, down, up, down. A signal that you might be traveling in the red or orange zone is if you need to eat every couple of hours to feel normal. To be clear, this does not mean that carbs are bad. Vibeke and I eat carbs pretty much every day. Slow digesting carbs, like those found in veggies or legumes, enter the bloodstream way more slowly than quick digesting carbs, like bagels and white rice and muffins, because they contain fiber. And when you add healthy fat and protein to the mix, again, you flatten that spike even further. So basically all this to say, if we want to be serious about delaying the onset of chronic disease, we must get our blood sugar under control. So it's definitely a factor for every person to examine when it comes to how and what we choose to eat to be healthy. All right, so to the diets. Vibeke is going to start us off with one of the most common diets in the US, and probably the only diet that both of us are not in favor of when it comes to pursuing health.
Yes. Okay. So before we get to the different diets that we are going to sort of compare to each other, we want you all to understand that what we are comparing them to as a backdrop, and that is the standard American diet, appropriately acronymed SAD. It consists of anywhere from 60 to 70% processed foods, and it is centered mainly around three things: convenience, shelf stability, and low price. It includes lots of foods that are engineered specifically to make you want more of them. So they've got sweet or salty or fatty components, or some combination of those three magic things. And it does tend to be woefully lacking in vegetables, and ketchup is not considered a vegetable. So that's the backdrop. We're not going to discuss it any further, but know that, any of these diets, if you pursue it with intention, will probably put you in better stead than the standard American diet. And then we're just going to move right into the first diet we're going to talk about here, which is the carnivore diet. There it is. And you can see it's kind of at that very low end of the carbohydrate continuum, because functionally it is zero carbs. So what is the carnivore diet? I don't know how many of you have been hearing about it, but it's been popping up on the radar a lot more lately. The technical definition is that you eat animal products only. So you would eat fish, you would eat meats, you would eat poultry, eggs. Some include dairy products, mostly low lactose dairy like hard cheeses, and essentially no plants or fungi, no mushrooms of any kind. Some carnivores do include honey, which is an animal product, and that does kind of move it on the carbohydrate continuum, but mostly they eat meat. So here is an image of like the kinds of foods you would eat. There it is. Kinds of food you would eat on a carnivore diet. They dressed it up with some herbs and a head of garlic to make it look pretty. And the thing that I really do want to draw your attention to here is the upper right of the board. That's a piece of meat, and it's actually a heart. And to the left of that is a ramekin of bone marrow. So organ meats like liver, heart, kidney, spleen, along with the bones and the marrow, these are very important components of a whole food carnivore diet. They are super nutrient dense, and they provide a different array of nutrients than just the muscle meat. And they help alleviate some of the nutrient deficiencies that you would otherwise be looking at with this diet. And this is called eating nose to tail. So you're eating the whole animal. You're not just selecting the muscle meat and discarding the rest. So if you're thinking this looks crazy, believe it or not, this can actually be a therapeutic diet for some people. So first of all, what is a therapeutic diet? It's a healing diet. It's typically prescribed A, short term, and B, for dealing with a specific health issue. So in the case of the carnivore diet, it would be people with digestive issues or autoimmune disorders or like food sensitivities, and people who haven't had luck dealing with these things using other diets. This is kind of a diet of last resort, you could say. And any benefit that people are experiencing from this diet is likely because plants are not actually just completely benign. They contain compounds that are irritating to some sensitive individuals. So here are some examples of those compounds. You can see a list here, and you may have heard about lectins or phytates, but what are these things really? In order to survive their co-evolution with animals that want to eat them and insects and fungi over the last 450 million years, plants have developed an arsenal of chemicals to protect themselves. And some of these chemicals are meant to discourage consumption and digestion by irritating the gut or by inhibiting digestive enzymes. Some of them bind to minerals like zinc or calcium in the gut, making those minerals less available to us. So for example, if you're compromised digestively and you have an inflamed gut, these anti-nutrients can cause more problems for you than they do for most other people. And in fact, other people, healthy people, benefit from a lot of these compounds. But so your current health context is actually really important in making a decision about what you should be eating. And genetics probably also does play a role here, but that is still under investigation. So for this reason, because of these plant compounds and because we're leaving them out on this carnivore diet, people can and do heal from eating only animal foods. And this is not something that you hear about that often. So we did want to bring this one up. All right, so let's talk about some of the pros and cons of carnivore, just kind of high level here. Excuse me, I have to cough a little bit. Carnivore can be great for balancing that blood sugar that Randi talked about because there's no carbohydrate really to worry about. So you're not going to spike your blood sugar and you're not going to spike your insulin. And it can, as I said, be helpful for certain health conditions. And the ones that I see pop up the most often in looking at this diet are fibromyalgia and eczema, like unresolved eczema. These are both very stubborn conditions. And, probably a lot of other health conditions where there's been no resolution with a lot of other diets. The cons, the biggest cons, you do need to eat nose to tail on this diet to avoid the main nutrient deficiencies. So if you don't like liver, if you don't like kidney, if you're not interested in bone marrow, then you must supplement. And there's a list of supplements you would have to be taking. And I think it would be hard if you weren't truly just a meat lover. If you're a person who loves your fresh fruits and vegetables, it's going to be tough for you. And if you're paying attention, you might be noticing that I'm not mentioning lack of fiber as a con. And you'd think it would be one. And it certainly can be in the long term, and it probably would be for most people. But it can also be a pro if you have dysbiosis or imbalanced gut microbes. You might want to reduce fiber for a period of time in order to starve out maybe some bad bugs that are overgrowing. And also, I would want to say that given how little we still actually know about the microbiome, we are still at the tip of the iceberg. And we also know that there are cultures who do eat very low fiber diets, at least for portions of the year, and still manage to be healthy. That we feel it's simply premature to say that fiber is definitively an issue for all people at all times. We really just don't know yet.
Okay, so before we go on to our next diet, let's just make a quick note on therapeutic diets. We just mentioned that the carnivore diet can be therapeutic for some people, and you'll see next that the ketogenic diet can also be therapeutic for certain conditions. However, there are many more healing diets that we can't cover today and chose not to because they're targeted to heal pretty specific conditions. And maybe one day we'll do a webinar just on these. But for example, the low FODMAP diet, if you've heard of that, can be helpful for people with IBS or SIBO. We know a gluten-free diet is a non-negotiable for celiacs. So there's a brief description of each of these listed here on this slide in your packet. So you can check that out and research from there. And for now, let's just return to the more commonly talked about diets. We're going to start by taking a look at keto, or the ketogenic diet. And you can see we're still at the low end of our carb continuum. So the ketogenic diet is probably the most popular weight loss diet lately, and it's called ketogenic because you are in ketosis. So what's ketosis? Ketosis is a metabolic state where your body burns fat as fuel instead of sugar, which means to get there, you have to deprive your body of sugar or glucose so that it can switch over to only and mainly burning fat for fuel. So to achieve that, you've got to eliminate basically all foods made mostly of sugar and starch, which means eliminating all high carb foods, including healthy ones like starchy vegetables like squash and potatoes and peas. So to get into ketosis, you have to eat a really specific ratio of macronutrients. So that means you're eating 70% fat. And of course, it makes sense, right? You need a lot of fat because you're using fat as your main source of fuel. So you would then eat 20 to 30% protein and between 5 and 10% carbohydrate, normally less than 50 grams of carb a day. So it's pretty low carb. And guess what? Your carbs don't come from bread and potatoes and all that kind of stuff. All your carbs have to come from low glycemic veggies like spinach and broccoli. And ketosis is pretty binary. You're either in ketosis or you are not. So there's no such thing as keto-ish or keto style. You know, if someone says, I'm eating keto style, it's not really a thing because you're either in ketosis or you're not. So how do you know if you're in ketosis? Well, you have to measure your ketones, and there are 3 different ways to do that. One is in urine using pee strips, and that's probably the most common. That's what you see here on this slide. The second is in blood using a finger prick, and the third is in your breath, and you use a breath monitor. Now you're going to see along the way that many of these diets can be done junk food style. This is what junk food keto can look like. Also called dirty keto. I kind of like that name. So dirty keto follows the same breakdown of fats, protein, and carbs, those same numbers that I gave you, 70% fat, 20 to 30% protein, 5 to 10% carb. But where clean keto encourages you to eat organic vegetables, pasture-raised meat, quality fats like MCT oil and grass-fed butter, on dirty keto, you can pretty much hit the drive-through for a bunless double cheeseburger with bacon and a diet orange soda, and you'd still be in ketosis. So yes, it would still be a keto diet. Would you be on the road to better health? Probably not. So on to the pros and cons of clean keto. Advantages: keto is really good at balancing blood sugar. Because it's low carb and you're eating good amounts of protein, fat, and some fiber, it's really good at balancing blood sugar. So it's a good way if you know your blood sugar is out of balance, it's one to consider. It reduces insulin levels, which can be very helpful if you're insulin resistant or type 2 diabetic. It can be very therapeutic for seizure disorders, things like epilepsy and other nervous system conditions like MS, like Parkinson's, like Alzheimer's. And lastly, it can be helpful for some cancers, especially ones that involve radiation therapy. So if any of that applies to you, talking to your doctor about a keto diet might be a good idea. In terms of disadvantages of keto, it can be difficult to implement because, like we said, it has to be done 100% right to be in ketosis. You have to make sure you're in ketosis all the time, and you've got to eat in a way that allows your body to stay in ketosis. And next, it can significantly raise cholesterol numbers in certain populations due to genetics. So if you do decide to investigate this diet, watch your cholesterol levels just to make sure you are not one of those people who are genetically susceptible to having it raise your cholesterol.
Okay, so moving a little bit up our carb continuum, I do want to say a few quick words about low carb diets in general. We've kind of talked about two of them, carnivore and keto. There are other low carb diets, lots of them actually. One classic is Atkins, that really at the end of the day just limit you to a specific number of carbs per day and don't really give a lot of instruction otherwise in terms of what foods you should eat. You should just count the carbs and make sure you stay under a certain number. So we want to talk about carbs again, because we're on a carb continuum here and we're kind of emphasizing it. So we want to say that carbohydrate is an important and normal part of the human diet. Individuals do vary and have varying tolerances based on things like their activity levels, their genetics, and their current state of blood sugar regulation. And I would go so far as to say that on average, Americans eat too many carbs for their own good. But this is not an indictment of carbohydrate. It's actually an indictment of the standard American diet and standard American lifestyle. Our bodies really seem to thrive under what we call happy medium circumstances, and carbohydrates are not an exception to this. Most biological systems, like the human body, are subject to what we call a U-shaped response curve. We've got an upside down U here, but it illustrates the idea. It means that either too little of something or too much of something can cause problems, and that there's a sweet spot for everything. So if you look at this graph, we're kind of showing the general concept, and on the bottom there you see increasing amount of X. And X can be lots of different things. It can be your activity level. It is possible to over-exercise. It can be how much sun exposure we get. And I think it's possible people are getting too little these days because we're concerned about aging and skin cancers. It applies to our stress levels. It applies to the status of every nutrient pretty much. And it applies to our immune response. And you can see that right now with COVID going around, that people are passing from these cytokine storms, which is an overactive immune system. So here again, we just want to make it clear that we are not saying that carbohydrate is bad. We just need to understand how carbs behave in our bodies and just to be conscious of the quality of the carbohydrates that we do consume. Also, most low carb diets involve, like I said, some variation on counting grams of carbohydrate in the meals that you eat. And this is where we kind of want to lump low carb, low fat, low calorie, all of these approaches into one sort of general concept. We're not going to go into a lot of detail on the other two, low fat and low cal, because I think they've been around long enough and we all sort of get the drill. You basically figure out a number, and it can be carbs or calories or fat grams, and you try to stay below that number each day. And so Randy and I call these diets the counting diets. And as a category, there's one comment we want to make about these diets. Anytime you're focused on only one aspect of the food you're eating, whether it's carbs or calories or grams of fat, it focuses your attention away from the ingredients in the food, the quality of the food, and from your own overall dietary pattern. And I actually want to just walk you through a real life example here to kind of make the point stick. So if you're focused on carbs, this is a loaf of white keto bread. I think you can get it at Costco. And here's the nutrition label. And you might look at this label and you can think, oh, I can have this today. If you look at the carb count there are 0 net grams of carbs in this food. And certainly I have that in my carb budget, and possibly give no further thought to what's in the food or whether that food is actually nourishing you. So if we take a closer look at this nutrition label and we zoom in on the ingredients, there they are, you can see that the vast majority of this bread is made up of modified wheat starch. So what is modified wheat starch, you might wonder? Well, it's mostly an ingredient that provides either structure or texture to a product. And pay attention, I am not saying a food. I am calling them ingredients and products. Most modified wheat starches are created through various chemical processes. It's a super processed, super refined food, and it contains even less nutrition than white flour, which isn't that much to begin with. And you can see this reflected in the very limited nutrient info on that panel there. Look at all those zeros. There's no nourishment for you in this bread. So the point here is to show that this is a trap to be aware of if you're real focused on counting carbs or calories or fat grams. No matter what diet you choose, don't fall into this trap. When you're looking at food labels, read the ingredient list first, and it should tell you what you need to know, or most of what you need to know about whether you should eat that food. All right, I got to click a couple more times here. We're going to move slightly up our little continuum to the paleo diet, which has been popular for, I don't know, at least a decade now. The paleo diet is basically based on the notion that for optimal health, humans should go back to eating what their ancestors ate before we became agrarians, and definitely before food became industrialized. So it would include things that you could theoretically hunt or gather. It's kind of a good way to conceptualize it. And those things would be fruits, berries, veggies, roots, tubers, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, eggs, wild meats, and fish. It does not include grains or conventional dairy. Some paleo people now allow for grass-fed dairy, but I will point out that our early ancestors, our pre-agrarian ancestors, were not milking the bison as they ran by, and dairy was probably not a component of their diets. Most importantly, I think in the paleo diet, it specifically excludes industrially processed foods. So that would be your refined flours, your sugar for sure, industrial seed oils like canola, soybean oil, cottonseed oil, vegetable oil, those kinds of things, and any foods that are made with those things. And we have talked about, junk food and whole food versions of these different diets. And is there a junk food version of paleo? There are more paleo-friendly packaged foods out there now. But given the specific exclusion of the refined flour and of the sugar and of the seed oils, they're less junky than a lot of the other junk food versions of the diets. So because they just tend to be less processed than the other ones. There are also a couple of subsets or offshoots of the paleo diet. One that is kind of gaining ground because we have a lot of autoimmune disease in this country is called AIP, or autoimmune paleo. It kind of starts with paleo, and then in addition to eliminating grains, the dairy, and the seed oils, this diet also eliminates nuts, seeds, eggs, nightshades, which are your tomatoes, potatoes, eggplant, and anything in the pepper family. This is another example of what we would consider a therapeutic diet, and it's specifically aimed at taming inflammation and calming the immune system for people with autoimmune conditions. And some sample autoimmune conditions are Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune thyroid disorder, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, vitiligo, scleroderma. There's actually now more than 80 autoimmune disorders that have been identified, and more are arriving daily, unfortunately. So if you have any autoimmune condition, this could be a good diet to investigate because it eliminates the top foods that can cause symptoms and immune reactivity. And because it's a therapeutic diet, the idea is that once symptoms are under control, you reintroduce foods. We don't want you to be on this restricted of a diet for forever, right? Okay, and then another offshoot that is, it's pretty popular and you might have heard of it is the Whole30. It's basically paleo, but it is somewhat stricter. It eliminates all alcohol, no sugar, no artificial sweeteners, no dairy, no legumes, no grains, and nothing processed at all. The big difference here is kind of the framework of it. It's specifically designed to be a 30-day reset, followed by a gradual reintroduction of what would be the no foods after those 30 days. They do provide a lot of support and recipe ideas. So if you're sort of, paleo curious or curious potentially about food sensitivities that you might have, it's kind of a handy pre-packaged way, kind of a done for you thing where you just sign up and they walk you through the process for 30 days. It can be helpful. So the paleo diet has frequently also been called the caveman diet and roundly mocked, which I understand. And the most common misconception about it is that it's always very low carb and that you eat tons of meat and animal fat. Well, here are some super normal paleo dinners. And you can see that they include anywhere from 2/3 to 3/4 high fiber plant foods. And these plant foods can be starchy or non-starchy. So unlike keto, you can eat as many or as few carbs as are appropriate for your individual carb tolerance and your activity levels. So the paleo diet is actually more flexible than a lot of people think. And before we go on to the pros and cons of paleo, I do want to talk about meat for a second, because we've just shown you several diets that include moderate to large amounts of meat. Meat has been getting a bad rap these days when it comes to health of individuals and health of the planet. And one problem here is that in the anti-meat world, all meat tends to get lumped together. And we feel that this is a mistake. There is a world of difference between animal meats where the animals are raised on pasture, eating what Mother Nature intended for them to eat, and animal raised in confinement settings like feedlots or warehouses or crates. Crucially here, the pastured animals, they get to live and behave as they would in nature and do not have to endure the stresses of confinement. It's better for the planet. You can actually use or manage, I should say ruminant animals to restore ecosystems and watersheds. There's a concept now called regenerative agriculture where ruminant animals play a big role, and it has other components as well. In terms of personal health, these animals, you don't have to worry about fecal contamination. You don't have to worry about antibiotic residues. Many of them have more favorable fatty acid profiles. So meat, and yes, even red meat, which I know is controversial, is a real, whole, nutrient-dense, traditional food that has been sustaining humans and ecosystems, frankly, in good health for hundreds of thousands of years. In the context of a plant-rich, whole food diet, meat is not the problem. We feel strongly that factory farming, both of plants and animals, is a critical issue that does need immediate focus. And I'm going to end my rant there. So back to paleo. The main pros, it's another one that's great for balancing blood sugar because it does eliminate grains, which can be a big source of carb for a lot of people. And it focuses on protein, healthy fats, and fiber, PFF. Unlike the other lower carb diets, it just from its origins had a specific focus on food quality and nutrient density. And this, in my opinion, is its biggest pro. And it can be, again, therapeutic for certain health conditions because it does balance that blood sugar and it does eliminate a lot of commonly inflammatory foods. So it can also help reveal food sensitivities. On the con side, if you're not buying packaged food and you are buying, cooking from scratch, basically, you end up spending a lot more time in the kitchen. And for a lot of people, this simply is not a realistic thing to do. And any of these diets, I think, done on a whole foods basis, you would end up doing more food prep time. So it's a con against paleo, and it is a potential con maybe against the others. A bigger con perhaps is that it can be very expensive because you are focusing on that pastured meat and those organic vegetables, and these do tend to cost more. All right, so we're going to move on up and we're going to talk about the Mediterranean diet. You'll see we put it right in the middle of the continuum today, and that's because it really doesn't lean in any particular way with regards to carbohydrate, at least not by design. The Mediterranean diet is based on the traditional foods that people used to eat in countries like Italy and Greece back in the 60s. And in that sense, it's actually kind of similar to the paleo diet in that the foodways of the Mediterranean region had not yet been very industrialized in the 60s. The emphasis here is on whole traditional foods, including moderate amounts of protein, especially seafood, high intake of olive oil and natural animal fats. And it does include legumes and grains and moderate amounts of red wine. It has lower intakes, typically of red meat, processed meats, refined carbs, and sweets. And I think just one interesting thing to note here, of all the diets we're going to talk about today, it is the only one that does not specifically eliminate any food group. But there is no one right way to follow the Mediterranean diet. You can look at this map and you can see there are, like, I don't know, 15 or 20 countries around the Mediterranean. And people in different countries and different regions ate very different foods, depending on how close they were to the ocean, whether they were in mountains or grasslands. They ate regionally. And so there's no really one true Mediterranean diet. So on the theme of sort of junk food versus whole food versions of these diets, on the left, this is what I would call a whole food Mediterranean dish. It's very nutrient dense. I would consider it blood sugar balancing. And on the right is, well, it looks really delicious, I would say. And I would also describe it as potentially Mediterranean. But a pasta meal has far less nutrition. It's basically based on refined white flour, and it will spike a lot of people's blood sugar. But again, the ingredient list for pasta it's less complicated and far simpler than maybe a lot of ultra processed packaged foods that you could buy on some of the other diets. So similar to paleo, this diet is a little bit harder to do junk food style because even the junk foods are less processed sort of by definition. What are some pros and cons? Biggest pros are there is a reduction in over-processed foods. It can be very nutrient dense. It's not restrictive, which is great for a lot of people. And it does have a great amount of research behind it because it's been mainstream for a really long time. So a lot of people have been studying it. Some cons, we showed you it can be implemented as a pasta and red wine diet. I would discourage that. And it can be challenging for people who they just need more guidelines, more structure. Just tell me what I need to eat and I'll do it. So your mileage may vary on this one.
Okay, we are moving up the carb continuum and we get next to vegetarianism. So vegetarians, as you probably know, do not eat animals of any kind, but they do eat foods that come from live animals. So things like eggs, milk, and cheese are a yes. And you may have heard of pescatarians too, and they add fish and seafood to that diet. Here's a beautiful whole food vegetarian meal, and I want you to note it's got PFF, protein, fat, and fiber, so it's probably a good choice for balancing blood sugar. But like all diets, it can be done in a healthy and unhealthy way. So all of the foods pictured here are vegetarian. This is what junk food vegetarian can look like. So, you know, sometimes, and a lot of times I think people choose to eat vegetarian because they want to be healthier, and it is and can be a very healthy diet, but you've got to make sure you're not falling for the junk food vegetarian choices all the time. So what you see here in this slide, don't do this. There's no nutrition here for you. So the pros and cons. Pros are that vegetarianism can shift people to eating more plants, more nutrients, and higher fiber foods, so really healthy. And of course, it can align with moral and ethical convictions and taste as well. Some people just don't like the taste of meat, and other people don't like the idea of eating it. And I would say too, if eating meat feels toxic to you in any way, then it's probably not a good choice for you, even if it were a healthy food, because it is and can be, but not if you don't feel that way about it. Cons, vegetarianism can be hard on blood sugar because it can tend to shift people toward higher carbohydrate consumption. So a lot of times vegetarian dishes will rely on grains and legumes and starchy vegetables, and those can spike your blood sugar if you are not paying attention. But it can definitely be avoided if somebody is mindful and they're thinking about that PFF, that protein, fat, and fiber, and they're watching their own response to starchy foods. And we talked about those symptoms of unbalanced blood sugar. So if you are eating vegetarian and you do get those symptoms, then take a look at how high a carb load you're eating and if you're eating enough protein and enough healthy fats with those. And that can be helpful. Next con is that it can be inflammatory for people with autoimmune conditions because grains, legumes, and dairy are some of the top inflammatory foods for people with autoimmune conditions. So a lot of people who really love being vegetarian but ended up with autoimmune conditions had to go and find another way of eating. It does take some awareness to get enough protein on a vegetarian diet, but it can definitely be done, and lots of people do it really well. And the only kind of main nutrient deficiency that you'll see, there are a couple, you see them here listed, but B12 is one of the bigger ones because that is mostly available in animal protein. And I will tell a quick story about my hiking partner, who's probably listening right now, who always kicks my butt on the trail, and she's always ahead of me. And I'm always saying, let's just drink some water for a second and stop. And many months back, she was like, I'm so tired. And I noticed she was behind me and I was in front, which felt really good. But I said, you know, have you checked your B12? Because you're vegetarian. I don't know if your doctor knows you're vegetarian. And she said, no, I haven't. So she got her doctor to check her B12 and she ended up supplementing. And of course, about a week later, she was kicking my booty again and she was in front of me. And so the moral of the story is never tell your hiking partner about B12 if she's vegetarian. Okay, moving up to the top of the carb continuum, we get to veganism. So you probably all know this by now, but vegans do not eat animals or foods that come from animals. So that means no eggs, no dairy, no cheese, no honey, and of course, no meat, chicken, or fish. So it's plants only if you're a vegan. So here's a gorgeous whole food vegan meal. And just by looking at it, we can see how high fiber it is. So you can see the chickpeas and all those veggies and the sunflower seeds on the side, really high fiber. Many popular vegan sources of protein like lentils, beans, nuts, and seeds have a high fiber content, which is really powerful when it comes to elimination, detoxification, and a healthy microbiome. So some pretty big heavy hitters in the health department. Like all diets, and it can be done healthy or it can be done junk food style. So if you take a look at all those products on the right of this slide, they're all vegan. So they're also highly processed and likely loaded with unhealthy oils and other mystery ingredients and probably contain low or no fiber. So whereas the foods on the right represent, the foods on the right are the processed, the foods on the left represent the rainbow. And they're full of phytonutrients and fiber and, you know, what we would call whole food vegan. So if you want to go vegan, we encourage you to choose a whole food approach, like the foods you see on the left with all those beautiful colors. And one quick note about protein. So it does take some planning to get sufficient protein on a vegan diet. How do you know if you're getting enough, or how do you know if you're not getting enough? Well, again, symptoms. So symptoms of insufficient protein can be sarcopenia, which means muscle wasting or muscle weakness, bone fractures, which can happen, reduced immune function, increased appetite, and brittle hair and nails. So any of those are kind of a sign your body is giving you that maybe you need a little more protein. Generally, it's recommended that we get about 1/3 of a gram of protein per pound of our body weight. So for example, a 140-pound sedentary woman would need about 50 grams of protein per day. So that would mean you'd need, let's say, 10 grams at breakfast and then 20 at lunch and dinner to make those 50. So if you wanted, let's say, 23 grams of protein at lunch or dinner, what do you need to eat? Well, we just did a little comparison here so you can get a sense. So 3 ounces of cooked lean sirloin or chicken, which is about the size of the palm of your hand, would give you 23 grams of protein, or 2 eggs and 2 ounces of cheese, or 1.5 cups of organic tofu, or 1 cup of cooked red lentils. So if we compare all of these options nutritionally, note that all of these proteins have similar calorie counts, but the lentils have a much higher carb count. So its impact on your blood sugar might be more noticeable if you're not pairing it with a good amount of healthy fat. Also know that the protein in the lentils is significantly less bioavailable than the protein in the tofu, meat, eggs, and cheese. So with lentils or other legumes and grains, which is very often where vegans get their protein, you'd likely absorb a little less protein and you'd need to bump up your portions to get the recommended amount. So if you're reading labels and you're trying to hit a certain protein number, you need to eat a little bit more of that food because what you are getting is a little bit less bioavailable or not available to your cells the same way. So all this to say that eliminating all animal products can require awareness when it comes to protein sufficiency and blood sugar control, but it can definitely be done well and lots of people do it successfully. So pros and cons. Pros of being vegan is, of course, number one, it often aligns with moral and ethical convictions. And again, if the thought of eating animal foods feels toxic to you, it's definitely not a good choice for you. Number two, it generally encourages eating of more plants, fruits, and veggies, which increases nutrient density. And number three, it definitely increases fiber, which is great for elimination, detoxification, and again, a healthy microbiome. So what are some of the cons? Well, it can take attention to balance blood sugar since complex carbs like legumes and grains are highly represented in this diet, but it can be done. And I actually just listened to a podcast by a woman who owns a blood glucose monitor. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with CGMs or continuous blood glucose monitors that you keep on your arm for a few weeks. And it tells you what your blood sugar is anytime you scan it. And so this woman was a vegan, but she really wanted her blood sugar to be balanced. And so she wore her glucose monitor and she tested out her foods. And for her personally, and like we say, everyone's different, you know, certain grains had to be out because they really spiked her. But if she added a lot of healthy fats to her lentils and her legumes, she was actually able to keep herself in ketosis. So I thought that was really interesting. So it can be done if you're wanting to do it. Next con is that it can create health problems over the long term due to nutrient depletions, especially bone fractures. And if you are a postmenopausal woman, that's even a higher risk there. So you need to be mindful of that. So that means supplementation is imperative to keep nutrient levels up. And you can see on the slide here, that is a list of the nutrients that I'd be marking down and talking to my doctor and asking my doctor to monitor to make sure that I did not become deficient. So it's a decent list there, and it's just something to work with a doctor on. And lastly, getting sufficient protein just requires some attention and some deliberate food choices. And we did find this really great website called The Vegan RD. RD is in registered dietitian.com. And it's a good source of honest information that can really help people be healthy vegans.
All right, so that concludes our run through of these 6 very different diets. And I want to step back for a second and just kind of go for I'm always going for the 60,000 foot view on everything. And this slide is really just to make the point that while each of these diets can have issues, as we've talked about, If you start from a whole foods basis with almost any of them, and I say almost because I do think the carnivore diet, has its issues, let's just say, you can construct some pretty darn nutritious meals. And if you blur your vision a little bit, wouldn't you say that all of these plates look somewhat similar? If you've paid attention to the pros and cons, you've heard that many of them can balance blood sugar. Many of them can be therapeutic for certain health conditions. Nutrient deficiencies are possible with all of them, probably less likely if you're eating in the middle of that carb spectrum that we were talking about. They do become more likely the further out to the edges you get. But so what are the common denominators of these very healthy looking plates? When I look at them, what I see is unprocessed foods, a lot of variety, and a lot of color. The carnivores even added some green sprinkles to their dish because they know color is important. So, and one other final thing that I want to say about these dishes, these photos are aspirational. I look at these pictures and I'm right back to my teenage years, looking at the fashion magazines and the skinny models and their beautiful clothes, and knowing that at 5 feet tall, that was never going to be me. And I know that many home cooks look at these dishes and just are like, I can't do that every day. So these are aspirational. This is something you can try to shoot for over the course of a day or the course of a week, to try to work in this level of variety and this level of different colors. Don't take these plates to be like, oh God, I could never do that, because you can. So to the big question, how do you choose? Most diets claim to be evidence-based, and any diet can be evidence-based because you can go on PubMed and you can find evidence. There's research to support lots of different diets. And so we think that, the evidence-based claim is maybe not where you should be focusing so much. We think you'll have the greatest likelihood of meeting your nutritional needs if you eat the most diverse whole food diet possible that your body tolerates and that aligns with your goals and your values. So to that end, we put together a list of 10 questions that you can ask yourself about how you want to eat. There's lots more questions you could come up with, but these will at least get you started, and they are all in your packet. So, you don't have to be taking notes or anything. The very first question: how well regulated is your blood sugar? We think it's imperative that you find out. Most people know how much they weigh, and most people have no idea what their blood sugar is doing. So some signs, as we said, if you're a person who can't go more than 2 or 3 hours without eating because you get shaky or lightheaded or irritable, or if you have that change in energy levels before or after meals, the answer is likely that your blood sugar is not well regulated. In this case, you would want to consider leaning lower carb to begin building some metabolic resilience, to begin training yourself to burn more fat for fuel, and to be sure to eat that PFF, protein, fat, and fiber, at each meal and at each snack. So just grabbing an apple isn't going to meet that requirement. So in this case, paleo and ketogenic diets can be good choices. You might want to start looking, sniffing around in that region. If you're a vegan or you're a vegetarian, you're going to want to load up on those healthy fats. And we would suggest you explore your personal response to grains versus other carbohydrate sources, because again, this is very bio-individual. And a glucometer, a glucose pinprick device can be very helpful here, or a continuous glucose monitor. Those are hard to get, but I think they're going to become more available soon. All right, so question number 2. Are you ethically against eating any meat? If the answer to this question is yes, then vegetarianism is a good choice. And the only supplementation is B12 and possibly some iron, some EPA, DHA, those longer chain omega-3s. And if you're over 50, you might want to consider some supplemental protein powder. If you're ethically against eating any animal products at all, then veganism is the clear choice. And like we said, just be sure to supplement with all of the above, the B12, et cetera, plus some of the vitamins and minerals that are more concentrated and more easily found in animal products. These would be things like zinc, some of the B vitamin complex, fully formed vitamin A, vitamin D, et cetera. And you'll want to work with a healthcare practitioner on this. Third question: How old are you? This is a question that most people don't really think about so much. But if you're over 50, and I am, as we age, we tend to absorb fewer nutrients and we lose muscle and bone density. Low muscle mass and poor muscle strength, sarcopenia, are common, and they are big risk factors for disability and increased mortality. So we like to say that muscle is the organ of longevity. You want to maintain it into your older years. So in this case, you're going to want to be looking at higher quality and quantity protein diets as a possible way to go. If you are committed to veganism and you're over 50, you are going to want to look into protein supplementation, and particularly with amino acids. It's a group of amino acids called branched chain amino acids. There are several of these that are very involved for muscle protein synthesis. So consider that. And give resistance training some real consideration. It's very important for maintaining muscle mass. Okay, question number 4. Do you have any kind of an autoimmune condition? Autoimmune conditions are so common these days, and we've mentioned a few: rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Hashimoto's, celiac, vitiligo. The list goes on. And in that case, you might want to give AIP, autoimmune paleo, a look to see if it can reduce inflammation and calm your immune system and reduce your symptoms. We have listed some good resources in your packet for AIP. And there's actually quite a long list of those because there are a lot of people doing that right now. All right, number 5. Do you have any kind of a neurological condition like Parkinson's, MS, Alzheimer's, ALS, epilepsy, or even like a recent traumatic brain injury? It could be, these conditions can be supported by a ketogenic diet. So you would want to talk to your healthcare practitioner about that, maybe look into the research on that. Keto can also be helpful for certain types of cancer. So if you have been diagnosed with cancer, or anyone with cancer, you would want to work again with a nutrition professional, because it does depend on the kind of cancer, to figure out if keto might be a good support in that kind of a situation. Number 6, does it seem like you have food sensitivities, but you can't figure out which ones? This is where an elimination diet can be very helpful. AIP is an aggressive elimination diet. Carnivore is even more aggressive. So you could go to that far end of the spectrum. The point here being that it's only for a short term, and eating meat for a month or a couple of months is not going to kill you. But the point being that once you're done with that period, you want to reintroduce foods. The goal here is to get to the broadest possible diet that you tolerate. So you're going to want to reintroduce foods one at a time, very systematically. And a nutrition coach, a health coach, could walk you through this process and help you with it. Okay, number 7. Are you trying to lose weight? We did say that this was not a talk on weight loss, but we do understand that a lot of people are trying to lose weight. And the bottom line is, not going to lie, you need to take in fewer calories than you burn. So low calorie is the most powerful way to lose weight. But a junk food calorie does not have the same impact on your body as a whole food calorie. And having good amounts of protein, fat, and fiber on hand help increase satiety. And when you're satiated, you're not hungry. And when you're not hungry, you're not miserable on a low calorie diet. And it's easier to eat fewer calories. So in this case, paleo, keto, Mediterranean, these can be good choices because they tend to be medium to lower carb. And depending on your metabolism, again, everybody's different, higher carbohydrate consumption relative to protein and fat can make you hungry more frequently. This is individual, but a lot of people experience this. So just so you know. All right, number 8. We haven't brought this up at all, and we've been talking about a lot of people with a lot of potential conditions, but what if you're a person with none of these issues that we've just mentioned? You've got great blood sugar regulation. You have even energy levels. You're at a healthy body weight. You don't have any autoimmune or other health conditions that you know about. First of all, congratulations. And second of all, in that case, we'd suggest, if you're sort of just diet curious, starting somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Not too extreme on either end, which is to say, eat the most diverse whole food diet possible. And if you're an athlete, you would just want to make sure that you're consuming enough calories to fuel your workouts and enough protein to facilitate your muscle repair and recovery. All right, number 9. This is important. What foods do you actually like? You should enjoy eating always, I think. If you're miserable, it's nothing you do is going to be sustainable. And if you're craving foods and you're wishing you had certain things, you're not going to stick with it in the long term. So choose a diet that feels sustainable for you from the pleasure perspective. And lastly, just some logistics. What's actually the most doable for you? Are you a person who needs really clear guidelines and structure, or do those things bring out your inner rebel? Do you travel a lot? Travel can be challenging, more or less challenging for different diets. Do you have children at home that you're also trying to feed? In these cases, you would maybe want to look at the commonalities in the diets and figure out how you can make sort of step-by-step healthy changes and substitutions to what you're currently doing. Just take small steps. So these are the 10 we came up with. You can probably come up with more. And like I said, they are all in your packets.
Okay, and if we have just fire hosed you and overwhelmed you, which we tend to do, then we want to talk about baby steps. So introducing the pick one diet. So consider, just instead of looking at these big diet groups, consider implementing one positive change at a time for 2 to 3 weeks. And I'm going to throw some ideas out at you just to get your brain going. So you could reduce alcohol or caffeine by half. If you know you're someone who relies on those more than you should, try reducing them in half for 3 weeks. You could change up your breakfast to make sure it includes PFF, protein, fat, and fiber. Or you could decide to stop eating by 7:30 every night. You could choose to eliminate all foods made with white flour. You could decide to double your veggie intake on weekdays. Basically, you could identify the one thing you now do that you know isn't healthy for you. And most of us know more than one, if you're me, things you're doing to sabotage your health, and just commit to making one small change for 3 weeks. They sound small, but these little changes are powerful because they are sustainable and they add up over time. So I think you'd be surprised at how just choosing to do one little thing differently for 3 weeks can influence the trajectory of your health.
Okay, and we're getting to the end here. We want to kind of close with a couple extra words, and one of them is dogma. You can see the definition here. Principle or set of principles laid down by an authority as incontrovertibly true. And while none of these diets really has a central organizing body or authority, they are frequently policed by enthusiasts, and especially online. So if you spend time online and you have been looking at nutrition stuff, you've probably seen this. And each diet does have its own set of guidelines, underlying beliefs, yes or no food lists. And these enthusiasts treat these things as if they are fundamental truths that apply to everybody. So people who modify their diets outside of these prescriptions can be made to feel bad or be scolded for kind of not doing it right. And, this is not good. We do believe, Randi and I, in the concept of bio-individuality. And we think that any diet that asserts that it's the best diet for everyone or makes any kind of blanket recommendation about what you should be eating, just run the other way, because this cannot possibly be true. In some corners of the nutrition world, there actually really are diet wars. You can go online and you can see everybody debunking everybody else on some topic. And Randi and I believe that when we get into a war over diet religion, actually everybody loses. And we don't have any interest in perpetuating any particular diet culture. At the end of the day, really, it's all just food. And it's not helpful to hold on to any nutrition advice as if it's canon. So here's what we do believe. We do believe that there's no right or wrong or good or bad diet other than possibly standard American diet or junk food, and that everybody's different. There's no one way of eating that works for everybody. And we do believe that even a way of eating that worked for you for a really long time, even decades, might stop working for you. And there's 3 main reasons for this. Some chronic conditions have very long symptom-free early stages that are not caught on standard like blood panels and whatnot. Insulin resistance is actually a big one here. Some nutrient deficiencies take a really long time to show up as symptoms. And our bodies simply change over time. Their requirements change. So, be open to changing your way of eating over time. Remember that just because a food is deemed healthy does not mean it's automatically a good choice for you. And don't be afraid to experiment and try different things at different times. And when you do, this is important, pay attention to your body's signals. Things like achy joints, fatigue, cognitive or mood issues. These are all sort of like the check engine light on your dashboard. When that light comes on, it's telling you that you need to look under the hood to figure out what's going on. And I can tell you just a little personal story. My skin was my check engine light. And I had acne as a kid, pretty standard, but it never went away. I had chronic adult acne, hormonal acne. It was all in my hairline here and along my jawline forever, up into my 40s. And I was always a fan of scratch cooking and health foods. And I was always kind of into nutrition. And I randomly tried paleo 10 years ago. Paleo was my personal door into all of this. You could enter through a different door. You could enter through the keto door or the vegan door, but mine was paleo, coincidentally. And I started on this diet and my acne cleared up in 2 weeks and my skin just started glowing. I didn't see it coming and I was not looking for it. I had always been a healthy eater and I thought, oh, my skin's just this way. But my skin had actually been trying to tell me something for all those years, and I never knew that I was supposed to be listening to it. So it's important to pay attention to these little things. Lastly, we think the most important thing you can focus on food-wise is nutrient density, regardless of which way you're eating. And if you're wondering about the nutrient density of your diet, a great way to see how you're doing is through this app called Chronometer. And we put a link to it in your packets. We're not affiliated with them in any way, but we want to share that we found this app very helpful in identifying the nutrient gaps in our own diets. There's a free version you can download. It does have ads, or there's a version you can pay for if you really like it. And if you use it diligently for as little as 2 weeks, you will get a much better feel for where the nutrient gaps are in your own diet. So to wrap up, look through that lens of nutrient density. We really enjoy the term nutrivore. So not carnivore, not herbivore, not even omnivore. If you're a nutrivore, you're making sure that as much as possible of what you're eating is whole food and nutrient dense, and that your diet is as varied as possible based on your tolerances. So variety in color, eat that rainbow, will give you the greatest chance of broadly meeting your nutrient requirements. So again, I'm just going to remind you, we are going to send you packets that kind of summarize all of this stuff, and we're going to stick around for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Vibeke and Randy, so much. It was an excellent presentation, so much great information. We do have a few questions, so I'll go ahead and read them off. First, from John, do you have any key points on intermittent fasting?
Well, we were going to include intermittent fasting in this presentation, but it just got so long that we had to leave it out because it was a little bit of an outlier from these diets that we've been talking about, because you can actually do intermittent fasting on any of these diets, or even on standard American diet for that matter. And Randy, you did look into it quite a bit as part of the planning for that process.
Yeah, overall, I would say I am a fan of intermittent fasting because, again, like Vibeke says, you can do it with any way you eat. You just set up your fasting window and your feeding window. There are real big health benefits like autophagy, where your body's cleaning out the debris. It's good housekeeping for your body. The one thing I would say where people can trip up is that it's very hard to fast when your blood sugar is not balanced. So if your blood sugar is balanced, then, the way I would start is I would set myself a 12-hour fasting window between the end of dinner and my breakfast. and I would only have water or herbal tea in those hours. And then I'd make that window longer and longer. And you can go as far as 24 hours if you want. But if your blood sugar is not balanced, you are going to struggle. And so I would suggest looking into paleo or keto, or figuring out, PFF. Make sure your blood sugar is balanced first, and it's going to be so much easier for you to make those fasting windows bigger as you go along. So hopefully that helps. And there's a great book by Jason Fung, all about fasting. So you can look up Jason Fung. He's got a huge following.
Thanks, Randi. Next question is from Jane. Can you elaborate on healthy oils? I get confused with paleo recommended coconut oil. Would this really be healthy? I do have genetic high cholesterol. Why is canola oil frowned on in paleo?
Okay, well, first, I'm going to say that our next presentation is going to be most likely on healthy fats, because it's a huge topic. So I'm not going to be able to give a super complete answer here, but coconut oil is very high in saturated fats. In fact, the tropical oils are the highest in saturated fat. We don't think that saturated fat just in and of itself is an unhealthy fat. Saturated fat occurs in any food that naturally has fat in it, and that includes olive oil. So I don't want to demonize it in any way. But if you do have familial hypercholesterolemia, if you've been diagnosed with that, then you do need to be more careful with things like saturated fat and cholesterol. So that's the short answer on that. But and then the canola oil question, let's see if I can be really brief. Canola oil is very high in polyunsaturated fats, which have been, deemed healthy by the medical establishment. Polyunsaturated fats are very fragile. They oxidize very easily when exposed to oxygen, and especially in the context of heat and light. And the way that canola oil, when it's harvested, when it's in the seed, it's not necessarily unhealthy. But the way that the oil is extracted from the seed typically is very damaging to the oil. It involves high pressure, it involves chemicals, it involves, these processes where the oil is just going to be oxidized. And then what they do is they bleach it to remove any rancidity odors and, things like that. So it looks like this beautiful, nice oil in this clear plastic bottle where now it's still being exposed to light. So it's not that, the oil is unhealthy in the seed. It's more about the process that's used to create the oil that you buy in the store. That's my shortest answer on canola oil.
Thank you, Vibeke. There's two more questions. Hopefully we can get to both of those before we wrap up. The first one is from Daniel. Can you briefly speak to substituting riced veggies such as broccoli and cauliflower versus seeds and grains like quinoa, brown rice, or buckwheat?
Randi, you want to take that one, or?
Well, I would say that I'm just not clear on the question. So are we talking about, let's say, using cauliflower rice instead of white rice, or brown rice instead of white rice? So if we're talking about blood sugar, any sort of grain, whether it's brown rice or white rice or oats, I would say you need to explore your personal reaction to it. So it is a higher carbohydrate food. And so I personally would go with the rice veggies. I'd go with the cauliflower rice. I'd go with the rice broccoli, or more of the veggies, which isn't to say that these other foods are bad foods. I think we just need to be mindful that they are higher carbohydrate foods. You definitely want the unrefined versions and smaller amounts and combined with protein, fat, and fiber. But if you're not super attached to them, or if you find that they do make your blood sugar go up and down, then you're just going to get more balanced blood sugar if you're going with the rice veggies. And I don't know if I answered that question. If Vibeke wanted to.
I think, well, I totally agree with that. And the only thing I would add is that if you look very broadly, grains are among the less nutrient dense foods out there. And you're going to also increase the nutrient density of your meal if you do riced broccoli as opposed to just rice, right? You're going to get more polyphenols and different minerals if you go with the vegetables. So another reason.
Great. And the last question is from Julie. Are grocery store bagged salads junk food, organic or not? Either one.
I would say no. I would say they are, I mean, it's still an identifiable vegetable. Granted, it's been probably harvested longer ago. And, you know, I'm not an expert on how rapidly vegetables lose nutrient density once they've been picked. I mean, there's some discussion around that, but honest to God, if they make it easier for you to incorporate vegetables into your diet, I think I give them a big thumbs up.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
I feel like there are bigger problems out there than
Yes.
that would be. That would be a good choice if it makes you eat it.
Yes, absolutely.
That's all for the questions. Thank you both, Vibeke and Randi, so much for the presentation. Thank you all for attending and for your great questions at the end. As they mentioned in the presentation, you'll receive a follow-up email from me with a packet of information and also a link to our video in case you'd like to revisit anything. And you can always go back to foodbanksbc.org and just go to the nutrition education page. Food is Medicine will be the first thing, and you can see any of our previous presentations or also have access to our podcast through the Food Bank website. So thank you so much to our presenters. Thank you for all the attendees, and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Bye.